Okay, so let's go ahead. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second season of the EDHEC virtual speaker series on the future of finance. I'm Emmanuel Jorzenko, director of the Graduate Finance Program. And again, it's my pleasure to welcome you today. So for this today's session, first, I want to introduce our two co-moderators. So we got David Zerbib, that is professor of finance at EDHEC, one of our experts in sustainable investing. We have also the pleasure to welcome Alexandre Heurtier. Alexandre is a student in the MSc in Sustainable Finance and Climate Change that is conducted in partnership with École des Mines. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's session. So we are very fortunate to have Jean Boissinot. So Jean is Deputy Director at Banque de France, he's the head of the Secretary of the NGFS, so Network for Greening the Finance System. And before joining the Banque de France, Jean held various positions at the Direction Générale du Trésor. He's an alumni of École Polytechnique and St. Paris School of Economics. And last but not least, Jean has published recently a book that I recommend, titled La Finance Verte, published from Duno. And here is the book. So I read yesterday and really learned a lot of stuff. So I really recommend all of you, if you did not already read it, please. And we will have kind of overview of some elements that he described in his book. So we are very happy to have him speak today and to help us to better understand what is about green finance, why finance matters for the zero carbon transition, and does climate change matter for finance. So without further ado, I'm turning to Jean. Welcome, Jean, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for the very kind words. So let me pull up my slides. All right, is it working? Perfect. Thank you very much. So again, thank you for the invitation to speak about green finance. And indeed, my keynote of today is, I would say, loosely inspired by the book. There's a few more things in the book, but I wanted to have a discussion with you today about making sense of green finance, because it is something that seems obvious, the idea of green finance. That everybody is speaking about, but in fact, there is a lot of confusion, I think, around it. And just to illustrate the confusion or the diversity of the perspective that you can have about green finance, I played with a few logos of things that you can loosely relate to green finance. And I think you would have given a slide twice as big. I could have filled up with some more things. So it's a bit of a disorganized field, I would say. And part of the specifics of green finance and the problem of green finance, I would argue, is that everyone is calling green finance something that he sees or she sees as green finance. And there is very little consensus around the idea, which in the end means that some would argue that green finance is the solution, and some would disagree and very much argue that it's a pure illusion. And I think that this keeps the discussion in a place where we cannot see exactly what finance has to do with the transition. And I would blame part of this confusion, I think, on the advocates for green finance, because you can find good, bad, and very ugly reasons to promote green finance. The good reason to me, and I will hope that you would be convinced at the end of the keynote that this is how we should be thinking about green finance. The good reason is that we need to finance the transition and to deliver a climate-consistent capital allocation. The bad reason, perhaps, is an argument that relates to the fact that public finances have been stretched to the limits over the past 10 to 15 years, and especially in the past 5 years. So you find people arguing that because of this limit that we have reached with regard to public finance, maybe there is a role for private finance to pick up the slack. And to me, what's a bit wrong with this idea is that, in fact, as we are looking at a complete transformation of the economy and the financing of that transformation, maybe we can look at precedent, and in no places or in no previous past episodes, I could see public finance being the main driver of an industrial revolution. Maybe the ugly reason to me of promoting green finance is the idea that financial policies will make it up for the lack of ambition of climate policies. It is hard to put a price on carbon. It is hard to have proper climate policies, and maybe we can let the financial sector do the heavy lifting there. It has to do with the idea of advancing a value-based agenda also, and I think that's something that is raising a lot of questions and raising pushback from many fronts. And overall, when we argue for green finance on the basis of not very good arguments, we run the risk of overpromising basically what finance can do and under-delivering in the end what finance is able to do. So before I jump to trying to substantiate this,
Jean, just
yes?
a question: is it possible just to increase the sound, because
I'll try to keep the mic closer. Sorry, apologies for that. So I'll speak less with my hands, which you didn't see. Sorry. So before jumping to the core of my demonstration, just a bit of an historical detour into how I get involved into green finance, and I think what really happened around the COP21 in Paris, which I think was fundamental for this development. So in 2011, 2012, we had a big discussion in France around the lack of progress in addressing climate change. It was just before the Grenelle conferences and the Grenelle laws and so on. And in fact, we see little progress in reality. And finance was identified as, the possible culprit for all that lack of progress. And the rationale behind that was twofold. Was mainly the fact that finance was seen as being in bed with the no transition team, the oil majors and the like. And that's true that the financial sector has a lot of connection with this type of companies because they've got a lot of friends, and this is clearly a type of client that would deserve special attention by the financial actors. But I think that beyond that, which we should not overestimate, there was also the idea that finance goes with the flow, and we are only financing what the economy is doing. So if the economy is not transitioning, well, it's a bit difficult for finance to transition ahead of the economy, and I think that's a more reasonable argument. But the real question behind that is not whether finance is responsible, but whether it's a good scapegoat for the lack of progress. But is it really the case that finance is holding back the transition? I mean, we all know that for the transition to happen, we need typically climate policies being implemented and investment decisions by firms and by households and so on. So is really finance holding back the transition? And we came out of that debate in my team with a better understanding of maybe we have to ask ourselves, is there something there that we should be looking at more closely beyond the kind of easy argument to put all the blame on finance? And soon after that, in fact, we were asked to work on the COP21 And the one key steer that we got from the finance minister, where I was for whom I was working at the time, was please don't let finance get in the way of an agreement in Paris. And for that to happen, we had to go past the idea that finance matter for the transition, which is obvious. You don't have a transition without investment, and you don't have investment without finance. And that's true both, in general in the economy, but also in the context of the COPs, because of the commitment that advanced economies have taken toward less advanced economies, the 100 billion question typically. So there's no matter disputing that finance matter for the transition, but the real question is the other way around, basically. What if climate change matter for finance? Because if climate change matters for finance, then it's a whole new set of things that we can, or things that we can play with, basically, to make some progress. And in answering that questions, basically, you can identify three main drivers. The first one is related to the no transition team arguments, and it's about financial institutions protecting their reputation, and it's a communication battle. It's I'm doing some nice things, and you're not doing, anything else than greenwashing, etc., etc. And it can eat up quite a lot and makes for good headlines, but very little progress on the ground. But that's one driver to get the attention of financial institutions on the transition. The second driver is more related to client demands and preference. And that's the idea that, and some financial institution would argue about that at that time and even today. If my clients want green products, green saving products, to finance green investment, I'm very happy to follow them. And if they want something that is less green, then so be it. And that's in relation, I think, to the idea that finance goes with the flow. The problem with that is that because we are not speaking of a set of preferences that are completely independent from one another and disconnected from reality, what you are doing when you are engaging into green finance only on the basis of your clients' demands, you're basically building up a balance sheet that half of it will thrive in the transition and the other one will fail. And if there is a lack of transition, half of it will fail and the other one will thrive. And I think it's not a very good management, risk and business management to basically build up your activities and your company in such a way that in any state of the world, you're losing half of what you have done. So I think the third and main driver for looking at what climate change means for finance is really about focusing on the economics of climate change and the net zero transition. And that's what I would try to get around with you in the coming slides, having in mind that I will be a bit quicker than with an uneducated audience. So this is, I think, very common ground for all of you, the fact that we are witnessing a rapidly rising global temperature, and that these anomalies, we cannot explain them without factoring in net human causes in the models that we have. So this has something to do with the GHG emission that we are producing. What is very important is also to keep in mind that we are witnessing the very first impact of climate change, but it is going to be a lot worse if we let it go and we don't address it. And in that respect, I mean, 1.5 degrees is not so good, but not as bad as 2 degrees, and certainly not as worse, so to speak, as an increase of 4 degrees. So there's really something to be done to minimize the level of climate change we are confronted with. And because that level is entirely dependent on the concentration of CO2 emissions, that really means that we need to get to a net zero situation. And that brings me to my next slide about carbon budget, which is what people don't completely realize. Net zero is not an option. It's the only question that we have to ask ourselves is, when do we reach net zero? Because we have to get to net zero if we want to stabilize the climate, whether it is to 1.5, 1.7, 1.2 degrees, or even 4 or 5. And that gives us basically the time frame for the transition, having in mind also that nothing in that is completely nothing is deterministic at all. It's really a shift in distribution. So we are basically making a bet on the future and trying to find the safest way to remain in a place that is comfortable enough. So some would argue that we are clearly not where we should be, and I would not disagree. But I would also like to highlight the fact that we are making some progress, and that things are maybe starting to be a bit less underwhelming than they used to be. Not completely overwhelming, but less underwhelming, I would argue. So basically, we have made a lot of progress if we compare to where we were before the COP21. And if you look into, and what matters is the graph at the bottom right of the slides. Basically, where we stand right now, we have, with the current policies, a 7% chance to remain below 2 degrees, and that's not a very comfortable place. But if we manage to implement the NDCs, this 7 goes to 16, and if we follow through with all the net zero targets that have been adopted by countries over the past 5 years since Paris, basically we've got 80%, well, more than 80% chance of staying below 2 degrees, and we've got a fairly good chance of staying below 20% chance of staying below 1.5 degree, which is really what we should be aiming at. So clearly, we are not where we want to be, but we are really making a lot of progress if we compare to where we were less than 10 years ago. And part of this progress is, I would say, predicated on the fact that the economics of the transition have been changing a lot. We are witnessing an industrial revolution that is happening. And it is happening not because of a lot of innovation being rolled out in the economy, but because a lot of things that are happening due to a constraint, basically. And this is somehow an industrial revolution in reverse motion, but or with a different driver. But what is quite clear is that now we have the capacity to produce electricity from renewable at cost and soon at scale, and that's covering about 40% of all the emissions. And that has a lot to do with the increase in the scale of what we have been doing with regard to installed capacity and what we have learned along the way. And when you look at the latest IPCC report, basically, you see that we have technical solutions for almost all problems related to GHG emission. And we know what to do. I mean, maybe it's hard to implement these policies, but we know what to do. Moving from the microeconomics to the macroeconomics of the net zero transition, it's also very important to understand that beyond making sure that all these investments happen, what really matters is not just the investment, but also what we will do, but also what we will not do. And if you look at it from a macro perspective, basically, the additional investment that we need is in the vicinity of a few hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So something that the financial sector knows how to deliver. And basically, if you look at the transition from this macro perspective, the transition is a capital allocation question. It's not about finding a lot of new resources and investing in difficult stuff. It's really about making sure that the capital allocation is delivered as it should. So what about green finance in that context, in that change of perspective? Basically, I would argue that we should frame climate change as a macro development. That means two things, basically. Bring nature back into the picture, make sure that we really account for the material impact of climate change, because it will have very real macro consequences, and understand that there is no alternative to net zero. And the second aspect to it is really to understand the scale and the dynamics of the industrial revolution that we are facing. And again, if you combine the question of no alternative to net zero and the very limited time frame that we have, and the fact that it's technically feasible and economically reasonable to transition our economies, basically we are in a place where it will be a macro question, not a micro question. So it's not something that will be a gradual adjustment. It's something that will, I hope, most probably happen in a limited time frame with big consequences on the macro side. And that's the reason why climate change is meaningful for finance. It's meaningful for finance because we need to grasp the full scale of the climate opportunity, but also because finance is in the business of building bridges to help the economy develop, and it's bridges that goes from now into the future. And we need to reassess basically the way we're thinking about this future, and really factor in climate change and the transition into all our financial decisions. Which brings me to what I would say is a better way to look at green finance, by distinguishing and to bring some order to the very diverse picture of the beginning, is to distinguish between the visible face or the visible side of green finance, financing green investments. And it's a question of well understanding the risk return of green projects. It's about managing technical risk. It's about technological risk. It's about taking into account the longer term perspective of these investments. It's about taking into account the system dimension of this investment, and the fact that there is a lot of system externalities into these decisions. It's about recognizing that we are facing takeoff risk, that we are dependent on policies when we are taking this investment decision and financing these investments. And it has brought a lot of financial innovations. Think about green bonds, think about a few others, blended finance and whatever. And it's about finding the right way to pair up the policy support and the financing, basically. It's also honestly a question of how to make sure that we are providing as much green asset as the investor side wants, because we are in a position of not having enough projects and assets to feed in the demand side of the market. And if we are not able to do so, then we will have a greenwashing problem. And greenwashing is just basically the volume question, the volume version of a price bubble. It's an insatiable demand chasing after too few assets. But beyond this very visible face of green finance, there is also I would say the hidden face of green finance, which is really where finance matters. It's not about financing wind farms and PVs. I mean, that's important, but that's not the main contribution of finance to the transition. Our main contribution to the transition is to make sure that the capital allocation we deliver, or the financial system is delivering, is consistent with the climate perspective. And this is something that really goes, I mean, the first side of green finance is maybe a few hundreds of billions or a few thousands of billions of dollars every year. The dark side is really about every single investment decision to be reassessed against the perspective of the change of climate on one end and the transition. on the other end. And basically, you can rearrange everything that you can think of in the field of green finance under these two items, and you can find that it is something that would speak to every bit of the financial system. So I think it's a better framework, basically, to think about what we are doing as financier in that respect, rather than arguing that it's about thematic funds, it's about ESG investing, or it's about green finance and blended finance, etc., etc. I think it's good that we have a collective understanding of how each bits and pieces is fitting with one another, and how this is contributing to the bigger transition. And maybe to conclude, just let me share two big questions that I think are important at this stage. The first one is related to the way climate risks are priced in or not. In fact, I would argue that most of the policy decisions that we are taking now, whether it is a microprudential regulation, macroprudential policy, monetary policy operation, and so on, in fact, we are making an implicit assumption around the fact that the climate risks are priced or not in the market. And whether it is the case or not, we should be taking very different, we should be considering very different options. So it's a very important questions on the policy side, I would say. On the private side, it's also quite clear that a lot of private sector practices are in fact also related to that assumption. And if we look carefully, and I wish there were more studies on that and more research on that, what we can see is that climate change is indeed increasingly priced in, especially over the past 5 to 7 years. But it's unclear to which extent these developments are priced in. It's not quite clear that they are all priced in out of the right baseline, or that we could basically infer some kind of market-implied baseline with regard to the transition. So one big question is really to try to understand what the market is telling us, and is pricing and not pricing, because that's where a lot of good or bad decision, or the basis on which a lot of good or bad decision will be made. And finally, there's one question that keeps us, that is haunting us, basically, once we have started to work on climate, is there something else beyond climate? And I will argue that on the basis of the work that we have done in the NGFS, we are actually currently doing a lot of reading and research. I would argue that indeed it's not just climate change that matters. There is a lot of, the more general problem is nature-blind economic decision. Is the fact that we are completely forgetting or taking for granted a number of things that we use, and that we should maybe question the continued availability, or the maintenance of the quality of them in the future. And that's clearly something that we need to reassess, basically. One line of arguments is to question whether this is somehow all be summed up into climate. And clearly, climate change is something that has a number of indirect impact on. But it's not just climate. And for example, if you think about freshwater, clearly, climate change will have an impact on freshwater availability, but a lot of the main problems are not related to climate. They are related to the way we manage the current resources that we have. Something that is a bit tricky is that, the risks that we are starting to look at, they're in fact a lot more local and granular than climate change. Climate change is in fact a global problem, and something that we can rather easily understand. But what we are looking at is, can be global in a number of cases, but is also very often a lot more local and a lot more granular. And when I'm saying that, it does not mean that it is less material from a macro perspective, just that it is a lot more complex to understand and identify. And this complexity is, in fact, the problem that we are facing. And we collectively need, I think, a tractable framework to account for this more local and more granular phenomenon. I think, and I would argue, that the current way of thinking about physical and transition risk is the right way and can be generalized to other nature-related developments. Now, the question is, everything that was easy to grasp and had to do with the ton of greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere, basically, that summed up the problem. What's the equivalent of that, or how to think about nature in general? And what I'm showing you on the right-hand side of the slides is a personal, at this stage, a personal thoughts around how to generalize the progress we have made with regard to climate change, basically connecting the planetary boundaries, which are the things that we will have to collectively address and that would matter for our societies, to ecosystem services, which is the thing that we use without thinking about it, and we are, our economy is dependent on. And if you think about it and try to generalize what we have done on climate change, basically, our dependencies on ecosystem services that are unpriced and overlooked so far can be related to physical risks on one hand, and the impact of our economic activities onto the planetary boundaries, basically, has to do with the transition risk. I mean, that's because we will try to manage the system to bring them back within manageable limits, that we will raise a number of transition risk. And then the question, if we want to generalize a bit or to use that framework for expanding what we have done on climate to other nature-related risk, the two questions that we need to address is to know whether going from the planetary boundaries to the ecosystem services that matters is enough, or if there are other development that we should take into account, and also to understand which ecosystem services we are using that we are critically dependent on. And I would argue that from a macro perspective, they are not all born equal, I would say. But the question to have this tractable framework, the question is, which are the ones that we should for sure include into our thinking? And that is about it. So very happy to get your reactions, comments, questions, and remarks.
Thank you very much, Jean. So right on time, so thanks. So now I let David and Alexandre ask some questions or reactions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jean, for this highly interesting and insightful presentation. You've clearly explained what green finance is today, what we should expect from green finance, and what we should not expect today. I'd like to ask you a kind of slightly provocative question to go straight to the point. So we are in a world where the carbon tax is probably not ambitious enough, especially in some areas in the world. We have evidence that the preferences for investors to purchase green assets is not that huge. And at the same time, we know that we want to re-embed finance within a nature ecosystem, if I may say, within natural constraints. So my question is, to which extent green finance can be coercive? What, in your opinion, is acceptable, and what is the limit of acceptability? Can we constrain investors not to invest in some asset, or compel them to invest at least X% of the balance sheet into green assets? Or from a central bank point of view, there are different avenues in terms of coercivity. Yeah, so I leave the floor open to you, Jean, for the answer.
Thanks a lot, David. So perhaps it's the time that I should stress a disclaimer that was on the first slide. Everything that I'm speaking about, or any views that I'm expressing tonight, are clearly personal ones, and it's it's a personal answer that I would give to your question. I fully agree that that we don't have the climate policies and the environmental policies that we need at this stage, and that's a problem. That's very much a problem, because in fact, if we want to manage the transition collectively, we need all actors to play their parts. We need the policymakers to set up and implement the right policies. And I mean, right policies means a lot of things. It means ambitious enough. It means sustainable policies that can be sustained over time. It means policies that are politically acceptable. So it means also just policies and so on. So I think it's important that we have these policies put in place. It's also important because without these policies, basically, none of the decisions that are taken by the economic actors will be fully aligned with the objective of re-embedding economic activity into nature. So we need these policies. Then we need the investment of firms and households to adjust to this new set of policies. And then we need the financial sector to understand the implication of the policies, so that basically it is able to discriminate between the good project and the bad projects early on, but also to be there to accompany the transition. So in fact, if I wanted to summarize my view on the transition, is that it's a tango that needs three beats to be danced, basically. So going to your question about coercivity, basically. No, before going to that coercivity question, your comment on the preference for green assets that you assess not to be very material or not to be important enough. I think there is a lot of appetite for green assets, and the problem is perhaps more, I would argue, more on the supply side of producing these green assets than on the demand side. But the problem is that what finance is able to do is always limited by the risk return of the project, basically. You cannot ask a normal financial institution to finance a project that is not bankable. That's clearly, especially if you're looking at financial intermediaries who have to respond to the two sides of their balance sheets, basically. It's impossible for them to be making that kind of arbitrage of giving precedence to the asset side or to the liability side. So they need to find the right place, and that's what the policy are there for, basically, reconciling the two parts of the equation and making sure that the project that should be bankable are bankable, and that the project that should not be bankable are not bankable. So that's where I see the issue. And then to your coercivity question, to me, it's really a question of what we think is the social value of the financial sector. Is it to bring funds to one place to another, or is it to allocate capital? If we think that the main value of the financial sector is just mechanically to move some resources from one end to the other in a very automatic way, I would say, maybe we can go for some coercivity. But that would require a lot of planning, a lot of information that I'm not sure anyone's have in the system. If we think that the social value of the financial system is really to deliver capital allocation that is informed by a lot of individual decisions, a lot of tâtonnements, a lot of bets, and so on, but that in the end goes into the right direction, then I would fear to interfere too much with that process by being coercive and by saying, okay, now what you need to finance is X% of your balance sheet should be devoted to green. That to me, it's a question that I'm faced with regularly. By investors saying, if someone can tell me what is green, I'm ready to finance. And my answer to that is, well, no one will tell you what is meaningful to finance. What really matters is for you to play your role as an investor and make sure that you're putting your money where it should be put in light of basically the future that as you see it, and as an informed view of the future as you can.
Thank you very much, Jean.
Perhaps just to jump to that, so the challenge with respect to this capital allocation is obviously how you assess the performance and the risk, right? And we are more in an uncertainty setting than in the risk setting. So I just wonder what we need to do in terms to progress toward this direction, because you need to have some information, you need to have some tools in terms of asset allocation. So what is your vision about where we stand today and what we need to progress toward this very important mission, which is the capital allocation, to have the right one with respect to the climate risk?
In a nutshell, I think we have started to move in the right direction, and we are clearly not where we should be yet. And we should not have a sequence approach to the problem, because we don't have the time to have this sequence approach to the problem. I mean, develop the perfect data and develop the perfect models and so on. And when we have perfect everything, then act upon those. I think it's, I mean, we are born to start experimenting and to innovate along the way. But I'm really mindful that about the urgency of what needs to happen in the grand scheme of things. I'm also quite impressed by the strengths of the momentum in the financial sector when things are done in the right way. Typically in the NGFS, so we are a network of central bank supervisors who have joined forces to develop the tools that we needed to do what we thought what we think we have to do with regard to climate change. So improve supervision, make sure that we are able to monitor climate-related risk at the macro level, take into account climate change in monetary policy, and so on and so forth. So it's really central banks trying to develop the tools that they need, because they have, as everyone, realized that they know way too little about what to do, but we need to go fast. I'm really impressed by the fact that 5 years ago it was some kind of visionary but completely out of the money bet by 8 institutions who said together, well, we need to collaborate to find the solutions. And we are now 140 institutions. We are collectively supervising all of the global systemically important banks, for example. So I mean, this is a group that is not marginal by any way you look at it, from advanced economies, from emerging markets, from developing economies, and the work is progressing steadily and really faster than everyone expected. I mean, 5 years ago, you would have told me that in 5 years we would have climate stress testing for real. I would have, be very happy, but I would have perhaps be a bit cautious about our collective ability to deliver, and that's what has happened. Also in the financial system, this is happening. You may remember that a bit more than 2 years ago, the ECB, as the single supervisory mechanism, the supervisory arm of the ECB, has set up supervisory expectation with regard to banks for what they have to do, or for what they should be able to do on climate. And they took an initial picture of the practices in the banking sector. And basically, we had 25% of the banks at the time who had at least a basic understanding of the risk. So clearly, we were starting from nowhere. 2 years later, they took the same picture, and this 25 is now 85. So a lot of progress in the past 2 years. What the ECB has also assessed is that basically all of the banks have material gaps. So not everything is perfect. A long way to that situation. But still, they have been able to identify best practices for almost all of their supervisory expectations. So it's possible to go where the supervisors think you should be operating with regard to be able to deliver this climate consistent capital allocation, which means basically having the right data, even if it's not perfect. You start measuring them, having the right credit decision process. Having the right sectorial policies, having the right management of your continuous management of your risk, and so on and so forth. So it's clearly a work in progress that we have to accelerate. But clearly, when we decide to go into that direction, it's something that we can deliver.
Thank you, Jean. So, Alexandre.
Yeah, thank you again for your presentation and for your book, very insightful. I may have a more macroeconomic question for you regarding a subject you mentioned. So you're talking about the heterogeneity of the economies, but also of responsibilities. You also talked about the commitment of $1 billion for the developing economies, but the targets is still not met. What do you think about the loss and damage fund that was announced at the COP27? And what, maybe a second question, what could be the role of private institutions to maybe be complementary to the public targets they have?
So maybe two ways of looking at your question. I think it's important that we collectively keep in mind this common but differentiated responsibility that we collectively have for climate change, and also keep in mind that it's a bit more complex than just advanced and emerging and developing economies as of now. So we need to also update the way we were thinking about this $100 billion pledge. But still, it's indeed a very important question, because the transition is not something that will happen if advanced economies only look after what has to happen in advanced economies and so on and so forth. I mean, the transition is more than a collection of domestic transition. There is a global dimension to that, and there is a lot of capital flows to be scaled up to finance investment in places that are that lack the resources to fund this investment. So it remains a very important question, how to scale up these capital flows. And to be completely honest, that's a question we are currently in the NGFS, but a few others in the multilateral, among the multilateral development banks and others are looking at, how to make it real that these capital flows happen, not because we have pledged they should happen, but because it's a necessity that they happen for the transition to happen. And it's both feasible and manageable. So on the loss and damages fund that was set up in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think it was a long overdue. I mean, that's again a personal comment. It was a long overdue decision. But I fear, as someone with a finance mind, that we are missing half of the decision. Basically, it's as if we have provided an insurance against the worst of climate change, but we have not capped the risk that climate change will keep on worsening and worsening and worsening. So I think it's something that is begging for a strengthening of the commitment of everyone to transition away from fossil fuels, basically. And if we can have these two bits, then I think we can start to think a lot more realistically about what needs to happen and what can happen with regard to cushioning the poorest economies and the less developed economies from this risk. And the case in mind is what has happened in Pakistan over the last year, with a dramatic heat wave in spring and early summer, moving into a catastrophic mousson in September, where literally 12% of the Pakistani's land that was underwater. So I mean, that's and the shock to the Pakistani economy is 10% of Pakistani's GDP. So it's something that is really, I mean, we need to find ways to make sure that we know how to usher and build back after this type of shocks. But it's meaningless to try to build back after this type of shocks if we don't do two things. First, limit the risk, which means that accelerate the transition, and second, build up resiliencies and adaptation when we rebuild after the shock. And in fact, we don't need to wait for the shock to embed adaptation, which I think brings me to trying to answer to your last bit, which is what's the role of the private sector for loss and damages. And I would fear to say that to me, loss and damages is not a private finance question, is a public finance question, because I don't see how to say it. I don't see the business model on which you can build up inflows and outflows, early mobilization of resources, and then payment back to the investor in that context. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's something that is a bit tricky. But something that I think is very important is embedding adaptation into the mindset of financial institution, and especially enhance the way financial insurance is contributing to solving the problem. Basically, if we could reveal the value of ex-ante adaptation to limit the cost and the risk and the cost of climate change, I think there we could find some kind of business model which the private sector could play a role in. But when it is to only indemnify for the losses and the loss and damages, I fear that it's really difficult for anyone who is not ready to lose the capital that he or she has invested to be active in that field.
Thank you very much. Maybe Mr. Zerbe, you have another question?
I was wondering whether we could leave the floor to the audience, because we have only 6 minutes remaining.
Yeah, so might be able to pick several questions. So I will take one coming from Shaya. Do you anticipate debt and equity capital to play fundamentally different roles in green finance?
I would argue that, in fact, so typically, green bonds, to me, if you understand it well, is a great instrument, because it's an instrument that is bringing some practices of the equity market into the bond market. Basically, to me, it's an engagement device for debt investors. So I think, obviously, we will not mix or we should not be confused about the role of debt and equity on both sides. But I think the two of them have something to play, and the two of them may be learning from the book of the other in that respect.
Thank you. Another question, which is related to, let's say, mine, considering the lack of historical data and the assumption that markets currently don't correctly price climate risk, how can models that seek to price climate risk be validated? Basically, how we be confident that these models are working? So, question of model risk.
Yeah, that's a very good one. So I think that first, it's good to make sure that when we say model, we can mean very different things. And when you are looking at economic models, you can play with a lot of exogenous that can tell you stories about the impact of climate change. So, in fact, what you need is to bring together the type of models that you are using more in the financial world with the type of models that comes more from the academic side of the conversation. And in fact, that's part of what we are doing in the NGFS, in building the NGFS climate scenarios. But yes, it's important to have in mind that some models can speak about something that we have not seen in the past, because they are built in such a way that you can play with the main drivers that you see for the future. And we need to have a better dialogue between these models, I think, and the financial models, which very often are built on the idea that well, the past is some form of equilibrium that will keep on repeating itself, which we know is completely untrue. Maybe back to the question. I think we also need to no, I won't be answering right now. I think something else we need to do is also stop thinking in terms of in a too probabilistic way, or trying to make prediction. We need to basically stop optimizing and thinking more in terms of robustness, basically. So maybe we have models that are not very good, but because we know that they are not very good, we should think about using them not to optimize or to maximize something, to maximize a return, but very much with regard to minimizing the risk that we are making the wrong decision. So we need to perhaps change a bit the way we think about models and the way we use them. That being said, I think it's not completely well. It's not too much to ask to basically tweak a discounted cash flow model, for example, to start see whether the model that we see, the price that we see, are in line with what we know about the rise in or the future damages of climate change, for example, or the rise in carbon prices and so on. So it's not something that we can say, well, we know for sure that it's price or not price. It's more like, to what extent can I infer something about these risks that we know for sure to be rising are or not reflected in the price. I mean, I hope it was clear enough. I'm sure it wasn't, but I hope it was clear.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps last question for today from Laurent. What are your views on the fact that the political momentum and rules seem to diverge between Europe, US, and China? Kind of geopolitical question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I hope that in fact the economics of the transition are starting to be too powerful to be ignored, and I think we can have reached that stage, so that cooperation between the big blocs can in fact be reestablished, because we have a common economic interest into moving toward the transition, and we have also, to be completely honest, a common interest in avoiding the worst of climate change. So the current geopolitical situation is not very conducive of an accelerated transition, but it might still be the case that we can manage manage it, and we can manage the adverse consequences of this lack of cooperation between the bloc.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if David or Alexandre want to add something before we close this session.
Just to say thank you again for this enlightening presentation.
Yes,
okay, so thanks to all. Thanks you again, Jean. Very great presentation. For the one that want to go a bit further, read the book. Before we close down, just take a moment to announce that there will be a next speaker series that will be on the Tuesday, 20th March. Will be a bit related. We'll have Alex Edmonds from LBS that will talk about, do a corporation get a purpose? So thanks. And Jean, if you want to conclude.
Yes, maybe Emmanuel, a final word. What I am very convinced of is that, in fact, every bit of the financial sector has to play its part to the transition. And the confusion that I was speaking of at the very beginning is, in fact, something that we should be leveraging off, because we need people in banks, we need people in big asset managers, in private equity firms, in institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, and the like. I mean, we need all of these players to in fact contribute to the transition. So there is not one single solution, but what we really all need to see happening is this kind of change from the very bottom to start to realign what we are doing with our common future.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean. And from our side, we are preparing the future generation of finance. So happy to contribute at our level. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks again, Jean, for taking the time and looking forward. À bientôt. Merci beaucoup.
See you.
Bye.
Merci David, merci Alexandre.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.